We're going to call the meeting to order. I'm Phil Gibson. I'm the chairperson pro tem. Our chairperson, Mark Kogler, is feeling under the weather, so we wish him well. Keep him in our thoughts. Hopefully he gets well soon. With that, I need to read a preamble. The city has returned to hybrid public meetings pursuant to AB 361, which allows for a deviation from the teleconference rules required by the Ralph M. Brown Act. Residents now have the option to attend the meeting in person or to participate remotely. To participate remotely, residents can live stream the meetings at www.prcity.com/YouTube and call 805-865-7276 to provide public comment via phone. The phone line will be open just prior to the start of the meeting and remain open throughout the meeting to ensure the opportunity for the public to comment on each item heard by the Commission. Written public comments can be submitted via email to planning@prcity.com. Those received prior to 12 o'clock noon on the day of the meeting to be posted to the city's website as an addendum to the agenda. If submitting written comments in advance of the meeting, please note the agenda item by number or name. Planning Commission meetings will be live streamed during the meeting and available to play later on YouTube by accessing the following link, www.prcity.com/YouTube. And with that, I would ask everybody to please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Yeah. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. May I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Covarrubias? Here. Commissioner Davis?
Here.
Commissioner Jorgensen?
Here.
Commissioner Gibson?
Here.
Commissioner Neal?
Here.
Commissioner Christensen?
Present.
Chairperson Kogler? So the record will reflect that Commissioner Kogler is absent tonight.
Thank you. May we have staff introductions, please?
Warren Frace, Community Development Director.
Marcy Reynoso and Ashley Peterson, Administrative Assistants.
Katie Bannister, Associate Planner.
Do we have
Isaac Rosen, Assistant the Attorney.
Okay, does that conclude all staff? All right. Next item, item E is general public comments regarding matters that are not on the agenda. Are there any comments from the public regarding matters not on the agenda? See nobody moving to the podium, we'll move on. Our item F, agenda items proposed to be tabled or rescheduled. Are there any items proposed to be tabled or rescheduled?
There are none.
Okay, thank you. Moves us in the next section, which is public hearings. There is one discussion item tonight. Item 1, presentation on City Council urgency ordinance for accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and junior accessory dwelling units, JADUs, P22-0121/RZN 22-05. May we have staff report, please?
Yeah, just real quick, I'll do a quick introduction on this item. This is a little unique tonight. Typically, when we make changes to the zoning ordinance, it goes through a formal public hearing at Planning Commission before it goes to City Council. This is what's being considered an urgency ordinance. It's going to go directly to City Council. So tonight, the Planning Commission is not going to be taking any formal action, but ADUs are an important component of the zoning ordinance and the planning laws. So we did want to take the extra step to come through the Planning Commission to present what's going to be heard by the City Council. The Planning Commission's up to speed. There's some changes in state law that required us to move quickly on that. That's why this is an urgency ordinance rather than a standard ordinance. We have to have this in effect before the end of the year. Next year, as we're doing the zoning code update, we'll have an opportunity to make some refinements to this ordinance. But right now, it's just important to get something in place before the end of the year. So that, we'll turn it over to Katie to make the presentation. That Isaac from BBK prepared a lot of this ordinance, so he's available for technical questions.
Okay, so as Warren said, this is an urgency ordinance for accessory dwelling units. Do you have the, I don't know, click. So for those uninitiated, accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are residential dwelling units that have complete independent living facilities, which means both a bathroom and a kitchen, as well as a bedroom or living area, that are located on a lot with a proposed or an existing primary residence. There's also a subclassification of ADUs within state law called a junior accessory dwelling unit, also called a JADU. And these are ADUs that are converted from existing space in a single-family residence. They can be as large as 500 square feet, but they do require owner occupancy on the site, on the same property. The owner doesn't have to live in the junior ADU, but they do have to live on the property. That's kind of typical would be to take a master bedroom suite and turn it into an ADU, put a little efficiency kitchen in there and make a separate living space, is kind of the typical JADU. ADUs are allowed in all zones where residences are allowed, single-family zoning districts, multifamily zoning districts, as well as our mixed-use zoning districts. And then an important part of state law is that ADUs do not count towards our allowed maximum density. So in a multifamily zone, we might allow 12 units to the acre, but we also have to allow accessory dwelling units above and beyond what our local zoning would allow. So a little bit of history. The city of Paso Robles first started allowing what most closely resembles an ADU back in 1983. They allowed senior housing units. There were some refinements over the year. In 2003, major refinement where the city started allowing what they called second units. The last time the city of Paso Robles passed the second unit ordinance or made amendments to the second unit ordinance was in 2005. We haven't actually touched our second unit ordinance since then, but the state of California has been very busy. Starting in 2016, they renamed what was formerly known as second units to accessory dwelling units, or ADUs as we now call them. It also, in 2016, the state allowed cities to allow junior ADUs. As I said, the city of Paso Robles had not adopted anything to adopt those changes. And then in 2019, the most significant changes to ADU law were adopted. I don't have them all enumerated here, but it reduced setbacks. It required cities to allow junior ADUs. It allowed multiple ADUs in multifamily districts. It required ADUs to be approved through a ministerial approval, and then the state eliminated development impact fees for small ADUs, those that are less than 750 square feet. The city has been complying with state law, the things that changed back in 2019, but they were not in our local ordinance. So we just would defer to state law. The state agency, Housing and Community Development, has put out some guidance, guidebook that helps us to interpret what state law has been up to this point. This year, two new state laws were enacted, one of which would make our local second unit ordinance and any other local refinements that we would like to have with ADUs void unless we pass an ordinance. And that's why we're here tonight, to talk about the urgency ordinance that we're taking to council next week, or I guess it is next week. So we don't want our ADU ordinance to be out of compliance with state law, so that's why we're here tonight. This is a simplification of a table that is in the new ordinance. There is a classification within state law the HCD handbook that I just referenced talks about a statewide exemption ADU. And so this table kind of enumerates the types of ADUs that are subject to those exemptions. In our ordinance, they're called building permit only ADUs. And so you can see there's kind of two types here, or site types. When the ADUs are accessory to a single family residence, you've got one set of rules. And then if the ADUs are accessory to a multifamily residence, you've got another set of rules. So in accessory to a single family residence, you can have both an accessory dwelling unit and, if the owner lives on the property, a junior accessory dwelling unit. Within those, you can kind of subclassify those into junior ADUs, interior ADUs, which are when existing space is converted into an ADU, and then a detached ADU, which in this case would be a limited detached ADU. And the limitation is that 800 square feet that you see in that that last column on the right. So you've got interior ADUs where you're converting space. There's no maximum size. So if you're taking existing space, the state says that we have to allow whatever size of an ADU you can fit into an existing building. Excuse me. You could even put it into the detached garage. And then moving down to the multifamily zoned or properties with a multifamily property. There's two types of ADUs. One is when there is a conversion of interior space. It has to be non-habitable spaces within multifamily developments, but you can convert up to 25% of the number of units. So let's say we had a 100-unit multifamily project. If you could find spaces within existing garages, attics, boiler rooms as listed in the HCD handbook, you could put an additional 25% of units on that multifamily site, so another 25 units in my example. In addition, you could build, the developer could build 2 detached ADUs, and those would be limited to the 4-foot side and rear setbacks, and then there is also a height limitation depending on whether or not you're located near a high-quality transit stop. The only high quality transit stop we have here in Paso Robles is the train station. So that higher height limitation will only apply within a half-mile walking distance of the train station. So the new ordinance would also include standards for sort of other ADUs. So ADUs that don't apply or wouldn't qualify for a state exemption or a building permit only ADU would be subject to the rules that we're going to list now. So the a non-state exempt, a statewide exemption ADU would be limited to 1,200 square feet as the maximum size. For setbacks, there's some rules within state law that allow, if you have an existing detached building like a garage or a shop or something, an ADU could be placed exactly where that existing building was located. You could demolish the old building and rebuild even if it has non-conforming setbacks. So we currently allow detached accessory structures to be 3 feet from property lines. We have historic buildings that were 1 foot off of a property line or no feet off of a property line, and they could be rebuilt as an ADU at that non-conforming setback per state law and our new ordinance. The new ordinance would require a 25-foot front setback for ADUs, and then compliant with state law would allow a 4-foot side and rear setback for ADUs. These ADUs would be subject to 10 feet of separation from other structures on the lot. In the R1 zoning district, a lot coverage limit of 50%, which is what we have currently in the R1. It would require 200 square feet of private open space for ADUs, which is the same as what we require for rear yard dwellings or duplexes in the Uptown Town Center specific plan, and then a landscaping requirement to plant 1 15-gallon tree for each ADU. Next slide. So there are some objective design standards included. We can't apply design standards that require sort of discretion, and so the objective design standards we've put into the ordinance. We've put a list of ways to make the ADU match the style of the primary residence. An ADU would have to provide 4 of the elements that are listed here. So we have the same roof style, same roof slope as the primary residence, having a same roof color or material, the same siding color or material as the primary residence. An ADU could comply by having the same eave depth, window and door trim, and then also they could provide porch or bay window or other facade articulation to break up long unbroken walls. So these are our objective design standards that we'll be taking. In the future, we hope to refine these and have maybe a more inclusive or a more expansive list. But this is what is in the urgency ordinance. Next slide. So there are some special rules that go along with ADUs. For some ADUs, we can require one parking space. Here's a short list of some of the exemptions that don't require any parking. JADUs do not have to be parked, so no additional parking has to be provided for JADUs, the junior ADUs. We cannot require parking when an ADU is converted from existing space in the primary dwelling or a detached garage. And then the one that we see the most often is that when an ADU is within a half-mile walking distance of a transit stop, and that's any transit stop. It doesn't have to be a high-quality transit stop. So anywhere the bus in Paso Robles stops, if the ADU is within a half-mile walking distance, we cannot require parking for the new ADU. Something to be aware of is when an ADU goes into a garage. It's like a single-family residence has a garage. If the garage is converted to an ADU, we cannot require that parking to be replaced, which we used to do before state law was changed. That actually doesn't apply to junior ADUs, just as a little asterisk. But when it's an ADU, we cannot require the parking to be replaced. We have included some parking design requirements in the urgency ordinance. The parking has to be on a paved surface, similar to other parking spaces in the city. The parking space cannot the parking space cannot be oriented so that someone parked in it would have to back into a collector or arterial street. We do have some spots in town. I could think of where Niblick and Creston Road come together. There's some houses where some of that parking would require a person trying to leave to back into a fairly busy street, which we want to avoid situations like that. The parking for an ADU cannot block turnarounds that are or circular drives for the primary residence. And then we've got some dimensions that are in line with the dimensions for parking in other parts of the city, but an ADU parking space would have to meet those same standards. Next slide. These are some standards that apply to all ADUs, whether they're the building permit only or the other ADUs. We cannot require fire sprinklers in ADUs unless they're required for the primary residence. For any other new residents in town, we do require fire sprinklers, and so this is a special exemption for ADUs when they are accessory to a house that doesn't have fire sprinklers. We do not allow short-term rentals in ADUs. This has actually been something we've been doing since January 1st of 2020. For any building permit that's issued for an ADU now and since January 1st, we do require owners to record a deed restriction, letting future owners know that ADU can never be used as a short-term rental. So we have all these sort of waivers and special fee breaks and things for ADUs, and so we want to see those go towards housing and not towards short-term rentals. So we do not allow short-term rentals in ADUs. There is a requirement that if the city sewer is not available for ADUs, they do have to go through the septic waiver program, just like any other residents in town. And then, as we said before, JADUs do require owner occupancy on the site. Next slide. And then I thought I had it in the slides, but and actually we'll see it here in the second change that we have to make to the urgency ordinance. There's some impact fee changes that actually started back in 2020, but we're putting them into the urgency ordinance as well. And so our legal counsel has advised us that several of the sections that we've included in the draft ordinance are not going to be possible to enforce. So the first is we're going to be deleting the section 21.78.05.C.3, which would have limited the size of an attached garage to just 200 square feet. The state is pushing so that that the ADUs can be really close to property lines, and so we wanted to see that structures really close to property lines be modest in size, and so we had intended to limit the size of the attached garage, but we've been advised that we can't do that, so that will be struck from the urgency ordinance before it goes to council. And then our legal counsel also wanted us to replace what we had placed in for fees. So we cannot charge development impact fees on ADUs that are 749 or smaller square feet. But for those that are 750 square feet or larger, we have to charge a fee that's proportionate with development impact fee that's proportionate for what we would have charged for the primary dwelling unit. We had tried to put in some language language that made it clear that we have a fee that is proportional, and that's in the city fee schedule, but the city attorney has advised us that we should go with the language that's below. And so that is what is listed here on this screen. Next slide. So this urgency ordinance is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act. The state did make ADU ordinances exempt, and so this is statutorily exempt from CEQA. And that really does conclude staff's report. So as we said, there is no formal action that the Planning Commission will be taking tonight. This is intended to advise you of what's going to City Council, but sort of next steps and how the evening can proceed. The Planning Commission can ask questions of staff, clarifying just as we do for other public hearings. There are obviously some members of the public here, and so we can take comments, and we'll make sure that those get forwarded on to the City Council. But then, and if the Planning Commission would like to, you can provide direction to staff for a future update on our ADU ordinance. This one's coming through pretty quickly, and if the Planning Commission has strong feelings, we can certainly make note of those for future amendments. And then ultimately, you'll just be receiving and filing this report. The City Council will be considering the urgency ordinance next week. On Tuesday evening at December 6th, there will be a public hearing for that meeting, and so the public is also welcome to make comments at that time. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Katie. Before we open the public hearing, I'd like to give the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions of staff. I'll start off on my left. Commissioner Covarrubias, do you have any questions for staff?
Thank you. Just one real quick one, Katie, about deed restricted situations. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
You bet. So the deed restriction is a document. It's kind of an agreement between the city and the person who's the owner who's pulling the permit. It's sometimes they're called deed notifications. It's something that's recorded on the title, and when you pull a title report, it comes up on the title report as a restriction on the property. So it just lets future owners know that they're buying a property that has an accessory dwelling unit, and they should be advised that they cannot use that accessory dwelling unit. There's a few other small restrictions in there, but they can't use the big one is that they can't use the accessory dwelling unit as a short-term rental. It also states that they can't sell it separately from the primary residence. It's one residence. It's not something that can be sold separately. There's a few other small things in the deed restriction, but the kind of the big one that gives them pause is that they can't use the ADU as a short-term rental.
Got it. Well explained. And just one last comment. The letter that we received, is Isaac or somebody going to just give some feedback on their thoughts of the letter? How are we going to handle that?
I don't think the commission. So Marcy was just mentioning. So the writer is essentially correct. Somebody could pull a permit for an accessory dwelling unit, move into the accessory dwelling unit. The owner could live in the accessory dwelling unit and then use the house as a residence. We have certainly seen that. So the restriction really is on that ADU for short-term rental. So that was the main sort of, as I recall from the letter. So the writer was concerned that home shares are kind of I think she described it as a loophole, a way to have a short-term rental with that's sort of above and beyond the non-hosted rentals that are capped in our city. And so the writer is correct. If somebody lives on the site, short-term rentals aren't seen as big of a nuisance when the owner is there on a site, and so we don't limit the number of home shares in town. But the short-term rental would not be able to go into the actual ADU.
Okay.
And Katie, just a note on that, if there's a correspondence received for that, maybe that's something that can go into the packet for the council urgency hearing.
Okay. No other questions.
Commissioner Davis?
Katie, just for clarification, I'm sure it's in there, but if it's an ADU or a junior ADU, either type, does there have to be owner occupied in one of the other units?
So a junior ADU does require owner occupancy. An ADU, a regular ADU, does not. So again, a single family residence, you can, or a property with a single family residence, you can build an ADU. So now you've got 2 units on a lot, no owner occupancy required. If you want that 3rd unit, one of those units has to be occupied by the owner. And in fact, if you wanted to permit the first one as a junior ADU, you would also require owner occupancy.
Let me just ask the question, is it possible that someone could have a junior ADU and the primary residence be used as a short-term rental? Is it possible to have that combination?
Yes, they could. The owner would have to live, right, the short-term rental could not be in the junior ADU, but it could be in the other part of the house.
Could be in the primary residence.
That's correct.
And so the owner would have to be, there have to be a designated person, but not necessarily on site.
If you have a junior ADU, the owner does have to live on the site.
Okay, but
If it was,
can you have, okay, this is a situation I'm in another jurisdiction, so I'm just trying to clarify it for our jurisdiction. Can you be in a junior junior ADU and live next to an STR? Can both operate in tandem without the owner present?
no, so in that situation, no. So if there's a junior ADU on the property, the
They'd
owner
have to live in the
the
residence.
owner must live on the site, right?
Or in the JDU, and they rent out the primary.
They could do that, yes.
Okay. Okay. If there's an existing STR, can there be a junior? There can't be then a junior ADU next to an existing STR.
They would be able to. The owner could live in the JADU.
Okay. All right. One other question, just I saw the 25% increase in the number of units with multifamily residential. How do we deal with a growing parking problem if there's that much increase?
So in the 2 years that this has been allowed, we have not seen anyone come in to convert multifamily. Not to say that it won't happen eventually, but we haven't had a rush on them. But yes, the state has said, city, you can't require as much parking if there's ADUs involved as you would like.
So we can't create a more stringent parking requirement than the state.
That's there. Yeah, the state has limited us. So if you're going into existing space, we can't require new parking for those new ADUs.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Jorgensen?
Katie, it sounds like there are some requirements for ADUs less than 800 square feet and others at 1,200 square feet. Could you clarify that difference? I didn't follow that.
I think the difference is hard to follow. I think that is one of the hopes that we have in the long term is the state law on ADUs is extremely hard to parse. And we hope in the future when we adopted not an urgency basis to have an ADU ordinance that is more coherent and easier to use. I think that your confusion is warranted. It is confusing, but there are some standards that we cannot apply to those sort of statewide exemption or building permit only ADUs. And I believe that Isaac, maybe you want to step in. I have a hard time parsing with the new ordinance what the difference really is.
I do as well. I mean, even as an attorney, I think it's written quite convoluted, but Commissioner, I think the question was the difference between the minimum 800 square feet versus 1,200 square feet, correct?
Yes, what are the different requirements and why are there different requirements?
Yeah, so Katie's absolutely correct. There are certain limitations placed on the city with respect to sort of the few areas where there's a little bit of local control, and that's even further limited to the extent there's ADUs that are less than 800 square feet or at 800 square feet. So I think one way to think of it is that the reason you see 800 square feet versus other size limits associated with ADUs is that even though the state allows us to do some local control over these ADUs, similar to some of our recent other state housing laws. In some instances, those local standards still must yield to the extent they preclude an ADU applicant for constructing an ADU that is up to 800 square feet.
And I think if you look in the staff report, like starting on page 16, 21.78.050, this is the section that only applies to those sort of larger ADUs. So it includes a maximum size of 1,200 square feet. It does, and then on letter D, you see there's a table of development standards that we can apply just to those sort of other ADUs, including a front setback, maximum lot coverage, requiring a 15-gallon tree to be planted, the building separations, and then those objective design standards, the architectural requirements. So those are all things that only apply to those larger ADUs.
Okay, thank you. That's on the way to understanding. Thank you. My next question actually has to do with those development design standards. I believe it was the architectural requirements. I beg your pardon, it's after that. The 7 items that are listed, the last one, the point of them being, it states to conform to the architecture of the existing primary dwelling. The last item says porch, bay window, or other facade articulation to break up flat wall planes. Does that mean those items listed are to conform with the existing house, or is this a different kind of category that?
I think it's intended also to continue to make it look like the house, but there are architectural features that are kind of encouraged in general. But if the primary residence had bay windows, we would hope to see bay window. That would be something that you would want to see on the ADU. And
so after the emergency ordinance is passed sometime in the next the new year, then this section and some others to be determined would be brought back to Planning Commission for further refinement?
That is our hope. So if you have ideas for architectural features that should be on this list, we definitely hope to see them.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Commissioner Christensen.
Thank you. I just have a couple of clarification questions, Katie. One would be, how is this going to affect any applications in process now? Do you guys have a plan to have you guys, I'm sure you've thought about it. I'm just curious if there's been a plan developed to how to handle those.
Most of the rules that we're seeing in the urgency ordinance are already in practice. We already apply those to ADU applications. There's definitely some refinements, the objective design standards. So I believe that the objective design standards, if you've already put in a building permit, I don't think those would apply to you. They would apply to new applications, Warren. Is that an accurate statement? Or would we apply them retroactively, the local refinements? Isaac, do you have?
Maybe Isaac.
Yeah, I would say so if someone comes in and files, or they have an existing ADU application on the books, as Katie mentioned sort of at the top of her presentation, to the extent there's any inconsistency locally, we have to rely on the state standards, which the department's already been handling, and in sort of consulting the HCD technical guidance. But I think the short answer is, if someone comes in with an ADU application or one's currently pending, they do need to follow objective standards.
Okay, because I'm thinking more of the projects that have been in the works that maybe are coming back for review or going to be heading into Planning Commission that maybe have multifamily or mixed use. That's what I'm wondering. That's kind of what I'm wondering about, how those are going to be dealt with. Do those get put on the back burner?
I think.
Go ahead. I'm sorry,
Commissioner. I think what makes it even more complicated is, as Katie mentioned, the permanent ordinance for ADU standards that will make up the permanent zoning code as part of the full overhaul, we'll go through the normal adoption process. It will come to the commission for consideration and revisions, et cetera, before moving on to city council. But what makes it so challenging about ADUs is that's the opportunity essentially for the decision makers to sort of offer input along the margins. What makes it challenging is once that local ordinance that's consistent with state law is on the books, the Planning Commission won't really see ADU applications except for rare instances where, you know, they fall outside of the state standards and may require some sort of discretionary entitlement. And it's challenging because there are instances where there are multifamily projects that seek to take advantage of utilizing several ADUs as part of the larger project. And it's not always a clear line because the decision makers can't sort of consider those ADUs otherwise consistent with state standards because it's a ministerial over-the-counter approval. So it can get even more complicated than it seems even tonight, I think, in terms of actual projects where the multifamily structure were to come as new construction to the Planning Commission normally, and then there may be an ADU component that's kind of outside of the purview of the Planning Commission or City Council. So yeah, it's complicated.
So the reason I bring it up, Isaac, is I'm thinking of projects that have been in the works currently not too long ago. And, you know, we've either DRC's seen them or they're in that process. Are they still going to be held to are you guys going to still be held to the 60-day standard on the ADU part of it? I mean,
So I think in terms of the practical process of plan checking these and running them through the process, we're not going to apply any more restrictive standards to permits that are already in. Okay. So and I think the only real new rule is the objective design standards. We're not going to come back and redesign them. So whatever they turned in, we're going to go with that. Okay. Now there may be some additional less restrictive items like setbacks that potentially they could ask for, and we would grant that if they ask for, you know, a new code section to be incorporated in the project. So we're not going to make anything more restrictive. If there's something less restrictive that they want to ask for, then that would be granted.
Okay. I think that answers my question. Thank you. I had a question in general, Katie, you talked briefly about if it's an existing structure. The west side has a lot of structures that are on the property line, you know, where eaves are over the property line. There's no easements for that or anything. How would that be handled in that type of situation?
So if the eave is going over the property line, we wouldn't allow them to reconstruct because that eave is, you know, it's illegal. It's not just non-conforming. But we actually have had ADUs go in, you know, the structure was right on the property line and they put it back right where it was. So they can do that. If it's going over the property line, that's a different situation. And we've also had a situation where there was a structure over an easement, and so they wouldn't be able to reconstruct over the easement where they just don't have the legal right to build. But the setback is.
So they still have to meet the design criteria, but they wouldn't be able to really literally build it back in place if it's, say, got an gable eave, for example, if that's going to be going over the property line.
Not over the property line, but right up to it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then is the requirement for, as Commissioner Davis was pointing out in her question in regards to the junior ADU and the requirement to live in one of them on site, and this is just out of curiosity, was that in because I read some of the new laws out there before this came to us. Was that in a state requirement, or is it kind of befuddled in that whole?
I believe it was an amendment made in 2019. So
it was existing already. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I just wasn't clear. Okay. Thank you. That's it for me for right now.
Commissioner Neal.
So I have a question regarding AB 2221 and SB 897, and the fact that if we don't have an urgency ordinance in by January 1st, it reverts to, we have no local regulation. Is that in perpetuity or until we are able to update our zoning ordinance in compliance with state law?
The second is my understanding. We would have no local ordinance until we adopt one that complies.
All right. And then I'm having a hard time understanding maximum size for 21.78.6 050C2. Unless I'm just excessively dense tonight, which could be the case.
What page is that?
It's page 16 on our agenda. And based on what I'm understanding, maybe it's less than or equal to 800 square feet. And then potentially, when applicable, development standards will be modified in the following order and only as necessary to enable the construction of a 800 or 800 square feet or smaller ADU, because 800 square feet is pretty kind of specific.
Right. It kind of goes back to those building permit only ADUs. So the state law says that we cannot enforce any development standard that would not allow somebody to build an 800 square foot ADU. So the point of the code section we're looking at, 21.78.050C2, is that when we have to not enforce a development standard, this is the priority that we will not enforce. We will first give up on lot coverage, and then if lot coverage doesn't get us there, we'll give up on separation of buildings, internal separations. If that still doesn't get the person to an 800 square foot unit, we will give up on the open space for that ADU. And then if that still doesn't get them, then we'll allow the building to get taller. If an overly tall building still doesn't get you to 800 square feet, then we would give up the 4 foot. We would allow a structure to intrude on the 4 foot rear and side setbacks and then a front setback. So it's a hierarchy of the development standards that we will see to allow somebody to build an 800 square foot unit.
Or small.
Right. No greater.
So I think the language might be slightly adjusted because it just says less than 800 square feet, but you could have an 800 square foot. And the other one is the construction of an 800 square foot. You could have less.
So if we clarified that both are no greater than, that would address your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that's it for me. Thank you.
Katie, I just have a couple myself. On page 17, going back to the item 5, the building separation, where it says a minimum separation of 10 feet shall be maintained between a detached ADU and other structures on the property. Can I, and maybe just be me being the devil's advocate, but could I get clarity on that? Is that intended to be 10 feet from other structures that people are living in, or literally any other structure, such as a detached garage, a shed, a carport, right? Is literally everything has to be 10 feet away? What's the intent on that?
So it is intended to be from all other structures. That's actually in our ordinance for just structures in general. So that's just carrying forward from existing. So this would be 10 feet from any other structure on the lot.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then on page 15, again, I was reading paragraph G, going back to some of my other commissioners' query about junior ADUs, and I believe I understand the intent. But honestly, that first sentence to me is extremely convoluted because I had to read it 4 or 5 times to try and understand what it said. It says, again, for the audience, it says, for any property with a JADU, a natural person with legal or equitable title to the parcel must reside in either the primary dwelling, an ADU, or the JADU on the same parcel as the person's legal domicile and permanent residence. I understand, I think the intent, that is extremely convoluted. I'll just leave it at that.
You can talk to Isaac about the convoluted language, but the intent is if the property is owned by a corporation, obviously the corporation can't live there. An individual, a natural human person has to live on the site.
Yeah, no, I understand from Commissioner Davis and my other reading that if it's a JADU, a person has to live there, but I think there's probably easier, clearer ways of saying that. So those would be my only comments. Okay, with that, we're going to move to, I'm going to open public hearing. First, we'll note again that we do have a letter from Linda Caldwell, so the record will reflect we do have one letter from somebody that was sent to us today, and it was alluded to by Commissioner Covarrubias that there is that letter. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to address the commission or staff on this matter? If so, go to the podium. Please state your name and your address so we have information for the minutes as to who's talking to us?
Name is Daryl Cooper. I live at 515 Grand Canyon Drive. I just have a couple questions, and maybe this isn't really for the Planning Commission, but who is this intended to live in these? Is this full-time living? Is this families? Can they be used for vacation rentals? What is the purpose of these? And is that dictated by the state? Or does the city have anything to say about this? I'm just kind of curious. I mean, we've got a homeless situation. I mean, is it intended to put homeless people into these, into neighborhoods? What is the intent? I don't know what it is. And now listening to the talk, some of the exemptions as far as like square footage and requirements, I know quite some, well, maybe 10 years ago, we put an addition on our house, and if we were to go over 500 square feet on the addition, we had to pay school impact fees. Are there going to be school impact fees on these buildings if there's going to be children living in them? And also, if it was over 500 square feet, even though my home was not required to have sprinklers in it, we would have had to have sprinkled the entire building, fire sprinklers. So these are some questions that I've got. And in regards to the utilities for these, are they going to be fed individually to the ADUs, or do they come off the home? Power runs from the home out to these, gas, water. Does the sewer tie into the existing, or are they going to have new sewer connections? Just general questions that I've gotten. I don't know if, I don't expect that the Planning Commission has these answers. I'm sure that Mr. Fraze does, if he would share them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We're going to, as our practice is, we take all the questions and then we'll have your questions answered as soon as everybody has a chance to ask. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask any questions? Go ahead and state your name and record, your address for the record, please.
Yeah. Here's a representative for Ritter Construction. My name is Chris Ritter. We're on 741 21st Street. We have a lot of people that are coming in calling us probably every week asking about ADUs, junior ADUs, wanting to build them. And I guess one of the things we're looking for is resources for these clients that are wanting to build them. And we're seeing them for different reasons. Some people just want a place for their children to live on a separate residence, or some people are wanting to rent them out as single family residence, which is helpful. Now I know that that's not really available anymore unless you had a permit before now. So I guess the main thing was just looking kind of for resources, the things that we can give to people that are calling us or asking in general. And then I also wanted a little bit of clarity on the difference between the interior ADU and the junior ADU. Thank you.
All right. Is there anyone else that'd like to ask any questions of the commissioner or the staff? No? Marcy, do we have anybody online that?
There's no callers.
Okay, no callers. All right. So one last chance before I close the public hearing. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close public hearing and ask staff to respond to the two speakers.
So I think the first questions are kind of some general questions. You know, I think the first was basically, you know, what is the purpose of these ADUs? So the state's basically taken fairly unprecedented action in terms of preempting city regulations of these accessory units. And the purpose of that is the state's determined that housing is just a crisis that's affecting all sectors of the economy and the public. And that's why they want to see these, you know, ADUs be built. So I think the state's intent is to increase the overall housing supply. They're not specific about exactly who occupies them. They can't be used for short-term rentals, so they have to be long-term rentals of some sort. But really the goal, I think, at the state level is just to increase the housing supply as quickly as possible, and ADUs was identified as being the best mechanism to do that. So that's why that's happening. Because the states identified these as such an important factor, they also preempted a lot of the standard regulations that we used to apply to development. So there are waivers for fees, the standard utility hookup requirements and connections aren't required for these. So basically the state's done everything they can to streamline building these. Fire sprinklers are waived in a number of cases as well. So they basically removed most of the restrictions that would apply to standard residential permitting for the last 40 or 50 years, just because they've identified this housing crisis as such an overriding need. So it is very unique, and that's why they've basically preempted the cities, because the cities literally for the last 10 or 15 years were pretty restrictive on the second unit ordinance, and that's why they got rid of the second units and converted it into ADUs, and then basically waived most of the rules. So I think in general, these are different, and what requirements were for additions and second units 5-6 years ago don't apply to these, and that's by design at a state level. In terms of interest in ADUs and resources and whatnot, I know the planning staff takes calls very regularly from the public answering questions. So if there are certain questions that contractors or builders are having about what the best process is or what's allowed either with an interior unit or an exterior unit, the planning department is the best resource. So contacting Darren or Katie or Darcy or Lori, is really your best approach there.
Turn my mic on. Just to try and clarify and address, could you, Mr. Cooper asked specifically about school impact fees, and it seemed to me I remembered in here that school impact fees still are being, that is up to the school district. Are the school impact fees being charged?
I believe if the ADU is 500 square feet or larger, they do charge a school impact fee.
That was my recollection from the reading. And then he'd also asked if utilities are separate. Is that as a choice of each applicant, or would it be something where they could be combined on the same sewer utility lines?
Water and sewer are taken off the main connection. Okay. Now, they could add additional connections if they wanted, but we can't require that. Electrical metering, I think there's sub-meters required on the detached unit?
They're not required, but because of tiered metering, people often want a separate meter.
Okay, so basically up to the applicant to make that choice. They could do either way, correct? Okay. And then just again to clarify for, I think it's Mr. Ritter indicated for the resource for clients, is it the intention of staff to have some sort of a handout or a web page or something that could be handed, something that doesn't work, for the staff just to say, here's some information? Or is it literally going to be just, we're going to call Darren and have Darren field the calls?
At this point, the HCD handbook is pretty good guidance.
Right.
If we could certainly create a handout. We hope to, in the not too distant future, have sort of more localized standards that kind of warrant the handout. But it certainly is something we could do. The handbook at this point is probably most helpful. And
there is an HCD handbook that you can give people?
That's correct.
Okay, so that would answer your question. And then the last, I think Mr. Ritter had a question about, he was confused about, I think your question was interior versus junior ADUs.
So kind of similar. So the interior ADU is not limited in size necessarily. So that's one difference. A JADU can only be 500 square feet. They both do come out of existing space. You can't do a junior ADU in a multifamily project. They're only allowed with a single family and single family. So some nuances, they're certainly similar, but the JADUs are a bit more limited.
Okay. All right. That's your question.
No, they would not.
Okay. All right, so that's the list of all my questions. So again, we had public hearing, we closed that, so I'm going to bring it back to the commission and see if the commissioners have any other further questions. I'm going to go in reverse order. So, Commissioner Christensen.
I don't think I have any specific comments, just generalization. This is a lot being mandated by the state, and we're just trying to weed our way through what's being thrown at the city and manage as best we can. So this is a good start, I suppose, for moving into next year. So that's all I've got to say.
Commissioner Neal.
I had all my questions answered in just an editorial comment. It's never good planning to use a blanket over the entire state. And it impacts communities differently. Disappointed that the state of California has decided to take this action. That's where we are.
Thank you. Commissioner Covarrubias.
Thank you. Just a clarity question, Katie. In situations where occupancy is required, how do we monitor that? How does the city monitor that? Just curious.
It's definitely a challenge. There is a deed restriction put on, so the future owners and everyone is aware that that is a requirement. But it's a moving target, and we don't have any plans to do active enforcement, as far as I'm aware. Warren may have more comments, but no, that's a challenge for sure. I think if we got a neighbor complaint or something, we would certainly look into it. But
Okay, that was going to be my next question, because I think that's probably one of the largest complaints that I hear about is situations where people know that there is no occupancy and people are basically doing what they want when it comes to rental, short-term or not short-term, long-term, whatever.
we definitely encourage those folks to let us know that we need to look into it.
Okay. And then just a quick clarification. So when you have a separate ADU on one legal parcel, the address, are they able to add a different address to that ADU that's separate from the main unit?
Yes, we do give the separate address for the ADU.
You do? Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Davis.
No real comment. I do have one more question, though. Maybe more, but one right now. I realize these ADUs are deed restricted, and I just think about all the homes that we've recently approved that might be interested in this. And some of these homes will have homeowners associations. So is there any interface between the owner and the homeowners association, and who supersedes?
I don't remember at what point the state stepped in, but homeowners associations are no longer able to prevent ADUs. That is also a preemption of the state.
So the ADUs back to architectural design would have no, it would be the planning department that would look for the architectural design. That the homeowners association wouldn't have any say in it.
I think, especially with the new projects, the specific plans, the developers likely are going to build ADUs as part of the projects. That was actually something we were going to encourage. The developers fully intend to comply with all the design guidelines. So at least initially, all the new construction, whether it's primary units or ADUs, are all going to follow the design guidelines. Now, it is possible in the future, homeowners could also add ADUs, and then they would just be subject to the minimum requirements rather than the specific plan design guidelines. But you won't see any difference initial construction. It's possible homeowners later could add
That's what I was thinking
lesser
later
units.
on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Jorgensen.
I don't have any other questions or comments.
Thank you. I concur, I think, with the comments from my fellow commissioners. Since I've been on the commission, I've had numerous people stress how important R1 zoning is to them, and that's part of the objection of the STRs, short-term rentals. And in the last, I think, year and a half, the number of laws that we've seen that basically have decimated that sanctity of R1 zoning, I think people would be surprised. They're going to be surprised when they start seeing things happening in their R1 neighborhoods, whether it's ADUs or some of the other laws increasing density beyond one residential unit per lot. So And I do find it unfortunate that this is how the the state does their planning process. Like Commissioner Neal said, that they do pass legislation to create an urgency situation where everybody has to scramble to try and force through some sort of local ordinances. I just find that appalling. That's really bad planning on behalf of the state. I recognize that we have a housing shortage. I do believe that, but that's a bad process. That'll conclude any comments I have. So with that, we have two options. Again, this, as stated, this is basically, we're not really going to take any formal action on this. The options presented are to either take the public comment, receive and file the presentation, or to take public comment, provide direction to staff on items to be considered in a future update to the ADU ordinance. And again, we're scrambling because of some recent legislation passed by the state so that we actually have some legislation in place, and then with the intention of coming back in the near future, working on refining this, correct? So any comments or direction, maybe commissioners? I'm not seeing anything from anybody, and the person that normally makes the motions seems as not interested either. So could I get a sense of the body that we're basically going to take public comment, receive and file the presentation? Is this a nod? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Isaac, we're taking public comment, receiving and filing presentation because we're told we're not supposed to take any formal action.
Correct. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying.
All right. Okay. With that concludes this first item. We're going to move through the rest of it, I think, pretty quickly. I don't see a consent calendar. Is there anything on a consent calendar?
There are no consent items tonight.
Okay. And other reports, is there a Paso Robles streetscapes and ad hoc committee report?
We don't have anything additional to add to any of those items tonight either.
Okay, for that or items 3 and 4?
Correct.
Okay, so
2 and 3.
2 and 3. So
we do want you to review 4.
Right, okay. So item 2 is the Paso Robles Streetscape Ad Hoc Committee report. There is no report. Item 3, Housing Constraints and Opportunities Committee, HCOC, Zoning Code Update Report. There is nothing to report on that. Item 4, Development Review Committee Rotation Schedule. Is there any dates any commissioners need some help if they're not going to be able to attend a DRC meeting? Yeah, Commissioner Jorgensen.
I will not be here the Monday after Christmas. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I'm guessing it's unlikely we have a meeting, but just in case, to go on record.
Okay. Are we having a DRC meeting the Monday after Christmas? I think that's no.
That's a holiday.
We're all saying no, so.
I thought that was a pretty safe, okay.
Pretty safe.
Katie's not coming in.
Then I'm good.
Yeah, I saw the head shaking no, so there's nobody going to attend. So, all right. Is there any other dates? No. Are there any other dates for any commissioner that's problematic you need somebody to cover for you? No? Seen none. Okay. Any other, moving to item K, planning commissioners' comments. Any other comments by the commissioners? Seen no? 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 Okay. There are no planning commissioners' comments. Are they staff comments?
Just a couple brief ones. Your next agenda, I believe, is December 13th. We've got a couple time extensions and then I think a couple reports. And then your second meeting will be canceled due to Christmas. And then we're looking at items for next year. I do expect that there's a number of industrial projects that are queuing up that we'll probably be seeing in the first quarter. So the first quarter will probably likely be fairly busy.
Okay. All right.
And I will be out for the 13th, so I will not be attending.
Okay. Please note, Commissioner Neal will not be in attendance on the December 13th meeting. All right? Is that it for staff comments? All right. With that, we have adjournment. We need a motion or we just by unanimous consent? We have a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? There's a second. There's a second in there so you can push your button. Mr. Davis, motion a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. let's go.